Welcome back to the AI Explained podcast. As AI gets more and more woven into our lives, there's something we really need to talk about: AI bias. And today, we're taking a deep dive into it.
Yeah, it's a big one, right?
Yeah, it is. We're going to be looking at a really fascinating article from Tech Radar. The title is, "What is AI Bias? Almost Everything You Should Know About Bias in AI Results."
It's pretty important we understand this stuff, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, especially as AI starts playing a bigger role in decision making, in all these different parts of our lives. So this article from Tech Radar really jumps right in, and it starts by defining AI bias. And it doesn't hold back. It talks about how AI systems can end up giving us results that are, well, discriminatory.
And that's the scary part, right?
Yeah, it is, because it's reflecting the biases that already exist in our society.
Like it's learning from us, the good and the bad.
Exactly. They have some pretty interesting examples in the article to show what they mean.
Oh, I like examples. Makes things clearer.
Me too. So one of them is this idea that if you ask an AI to generate an image of a doctor, you know what you're more likely to get.
Oh, what? A man in a white coat?
Yep. But if you ask it for a nurse,
I bet it's a woman.
you got it,
Yeah.
a female nurse, it's picking up on those stereotypes. Like, how often do you see a male nurse portrayed in media?
Not often enough, that's for sure.
Right. It makes you think about all those little biases that we might not even realize we have. And this is where it gets really interesting. The article talks about an analysis where they looked at AI-generated images. And guess what they found? People with lighter skin were way more likely to be depicted in, like, higher-paying jobs.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty messed up.
I know, and that's what we're talking about, right? It's not that the AI is intentionally being biased. It's that it's learning from the data that we're feeding it.
Which is already biased.
Yeah.
So we have to be really careful because it can make those inequalities in society even worse.
Exactly. It's not just reflecting them, it could actually amplify them.
It's a bit of a scary thought, but important to think about.
Definitely. So the article goes on to break down how this bias actually gets into AI. They outline 6 main ways it can happen, kind of like pathways for bias.
Pathways for bias, huh? That's a good way to think about it. What's the first one?
The first one is the most obvious, I think. It's biased training data.
Makes sense, right? If you train an AI on biased data, you're going to get biased results, like garbage in, garbage out sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
All
It's
right.
like you're teaching a kid with outdated textbooks.
Yeah,
They're not going to get the full picture.
totally. What's the next one?
The next one is bias labels.
Oh, yeah, labels are important.
Yeah, they are, especially in supervised learning, where the data is labeled or categorized. If those labels are wrong or biased, that gets passed on to the AI.
It's like if you tell the AI that all cats are black and then show it a white cat, it's going to be confused, right?
Exactly. And then we have algorithmic bias, which is a bit more complex.
Hmm.
It's the idea that the actual methods used to train the AI can make bias worse.
So even if the data is pretty good, the way it's processed can introduce bias.
That's the idea. Think about an algorithm that's all about speed, It wants to get results fast. So it might choose the easiest data to access, which could be biased, instead of looking for more diverse data that takes a bit longer to process.
So it's cutting corners and ending up with biased results.
Unfortunately, yeah. And then there's something called implicit associations, which is where unintentional bias in the training data, like in the language or the context, can lead to problems.
Ah, so even if you're not trying to be biased, it can still sneak in. Like, what kind of language are we talking about here?
Well, the article gives an example of an AI that was trained on text that, without realizing it, linked women to domestic tasks. So guess what? The AI started generating stuff that reinforced those stereotypes, even though that wasn't the intention.
Tricky, huh? It's like those hidden messages you sometimes see in ads.
Right. And it can be really subtle, those kinds of biases. Then there's the human factor, of course.
Oh, yeah. We can't forget about us.
Definitely not. So developers, data annotators, even the users can bring their own biases into the mix. And that can happen during development or even when they're interacting with the AI.
It's a good reminder that AI is a human creation, right? We're the ones building it.
Exactly. And if the teams that are building these AI systems aren't diverse, that's a problem.
Yeah, you need different perspectives, different backgrounds
Yeah.
to catch those blind spots.
Absolutely. And finally, the article talks about lack of context.
Lack of context, huh? How does that play into bias?
Well, they give this really interesting example. Imagine asking an AI to generate an image of a Barbie from South Sudan. Sounds harmless enough,
Well,
right?
yeah, why not?
But because data sets often show South Sudan with, images of conflict and stuff, the AI might decide to depict her with a machine gun. And that's obviously not representative of everyone in South Sudan, is it?
No, not at all.
Like, the AI is making connections based on the data, but it's missing that bigger picture. It doesn't understand the nuances of culture and context the way humans do.
It's making assumptions based on limited information. We've all done that, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. But it's a good reminder that we need to teach AI not only to process information, but also to understand context, you know?
It's like teaching it to read between the lines.
Exactly. So we've seen how bias can sneak into AI in all sorts of ways. But the big question is, can AI ever be truly unbiased?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And the article kind of dances around it. They don't give a straight answer. Do you think it's possible to have a totally unbiased AI?
It's tough to say. I mean, if the data it's learning from is created by humans, and humans are inherently biased.
Yeah, it seems like a tough challenge.
But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right? The article suggests that even if we can achieve perfect objectivity, AI can definitely be designed to be more impartial than humans in certain areas.
So it's not about eliminating bias completely, but about minimizing it as much as possible.
Exactly. It's an ongoing effort, constantly looking for biases and trying to mitigate them. It's like we're playing whack-a-mole.
I like that analogy. You whack one bias and another one pops up.
That's AI bias for you. But here's the thing. The article emphasizes that figuring out if there's bias isn't just about numbers. We need a bunch of approaches, like looking at the data, getting experts to review it, and doing real-world testing to see how it actually performs.
So it's not just about the tech, but about bringing in human judgment and real-world experience.
Absolutely. And as AI gets more sophisticated and starts doing more, we need to be extra careful and watch out for new biases that we might not even have thought of before.
This is like a never-ending challenge.
It is, but it's one we have to tackle head on if we want AI to be a force for good in the world.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of tackling challenges, the Tech Radar article doesn't just leave us hanging. They actually dive into some strategies for mitigating AI bias, which we'll explore right after this break.
Sounds good. Can't wait to hear about those. Welcome back. So, before a break, we were talking about how tricky it can be to get rid of AI bias completely. Like, do we want AI to just show us the world as it is, even the bad parts, or should it try to be more idealistic, you know?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's like, do we want the truth, even if it's ugly, or do we want AI to show us a more perfect version of things, even if it's not totally realistic?
It's a balancing act, for sure.
The Tech Radar article seems to be saying that the best way to handle it is to find some kind of middle ground. Like not choosing one side over the other, but trying to create AI systems that are both honest about the world and fair at the same time.
Yeah, it's not easy, right?
Not at all. But it sounds like it all starts with the data we use to train the AI, the algorithms we create, and even how we interact with those systems. We have to be careful at every step of the way.
Absolutely. So beyond those things we talked about earlier, like making sure the teams that are building AI are diverse and having ethical review boards, there are some actual technical things we can do to try and minimize bias. Like remember we talked about retrieval augmented generation, or RAD.
Yeah, that's the one where the AI can pull in information from more sources, right, to give it a broader perspective.
Right. So imagine you've got this AI chatbot that's been trained on, let's say, customer service conversations. Now, that data set might already have biases baked in, depending on, who the customers are, what kind of problems they're having.
So the AI's responses might be different depending on those biases.
That's the risk. But with RAG, the cool thing is that the AI can go beyond that initial data set. It can actually access other stuff like knowledge bases, articles, all kinds of external sources.
It's like giving the AI a research assistant. So I want to double check its facts and make sure it's not missing something important.
Exactly. So instead of just relying on what it was initially trained on, which might be limited, it can draw on a much wider range of information.
Yeah.
And that can help to balance things out.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the more perspectives the AI has access to, the less likely it is to get stuck in a biased rut.
Exactly. RAG can be especially helpful when you're dealing with data sets that are, smaller or maybe not as diverse as you'd like. Adding in information from all these different sources can help make sure the AI's responses are more representative, more fair.
That's really interesting. It sounds like a pretty powerful tool. So what about some of the other strategies like pre-generating responses? That was another one the article mentioned.
Yeah, that one's particularly useful for topics that are, a bit sensitive. Let's stick with that example of the AI-powered hiring tool, the one that's screening job applicants.
Yeah, that's a good one. There's a lot of potential for bias there.
Totally. So, to try and reduce that bias, a company could pre-write responses to questions that might touch on things like gender or race.
So instead of letting the AI come up with answers on its own, which could be influenced by, all that biased data it might have been trained on, they give it specific answers that have already been checked to make sure they're fair.
That's the idea. It gives them more control over what the AI is saying, especially in those interactions that could be really sensitive.
It's like having a script for those tricky conversations, right?
Yeah.
To make sure nothing goes off the rails.
Exactly. Of course, you have to be really careful with those pre-written responses too. You don't want to accidentally introduce new biases.
It sounds like it takes a lot of thought and careful planning.
It does. You need people from different backgrounds and areas of expertise to weigh in and make sure everything is as balanced and unbiased as possible.
It's like checks and balances again. You need multiple perspectives to catch things you might miss on your own.
Absolutely. Now, the article also talks about something called fine-tuning, and it's all about training the AI on data that's specifically related to the job it's going to be doing.
So it's like giving it specialized training, kind of like you would for a human in a specific profession.
Exactly. So going back to that hiring tool example, instead of just feeding it a giant pile of resumes, you might train it on a set of resumes from people who are already successful in the specific role the company is hiring for.
So if they're looking for software engineers, they would train the AI on resumes from, top software engineers.
Exactly. That way, the AI is learning what really matters for that particular job.
It's like instead of just looking for general patterns, it's getting a much deeper understanding of what success looks like in that specific field.
Right. And by doing that, you can potentially reduce bias because the AI isn't relying on those broad stereotypes or assumptions about what a good candidate looks like.
It's like giving it a more nuanced view of the world, right?
Mhm.
Instead of just relying on those surface level judgments.
Exactly. So we've talked a lot about how important the training data is, but it's not enough to just set it up and forget about it. You have to keep an eye on things.
So it's not a one-time fix, it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. AI systems are constantly learning and changing as they interact with new data and users, so you have to keep monitoring them and running tests to catch any biases that might pop up along the way.
It's like doing regular checkups to make sure everything is still working properly.
That's a great way to put it. You're constantly looking for signs of trouble, so you can address them before they become big problems.
So how do you actually monitor an AI system for bias? Like, what are you looking for?
Well, one thing you can do is analyze the AI's decisions, the outputs it's generating. Look for any patterns that might suggest bias. Like, let's say you're looking at that hiring tool again. You might check to see if there are any significant differences in how it's recommending candidates from different demographic groups.
So are there more men being recommended than women, for example? Or more people from a certain racial or ethnic group?
Exactly. If you see big disparities, it could be a sign that there's bias going on.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like looking for those red flags that might indicate something's not quite right.
Right. And you can get even more sophisticated with things like A/B testing. That's where you create two versions of the AI system and compare how they perform.
So like having a control group and an experimental group, like in a science experiment?
That's the idea. So you might have one version of a chatbot that's been trained on a data set that includes lots of different accents and dialects, and another version that's been trained on a more limited data set. And then you see which one does a better job of understanding and responding to people.
That's really interesting. It's like you're testing different approaches to see which one leads to the least biased results.
Exactly. And remember those prompts we talked about earlier, the ones that can uncover hidden biases? Like asking the AI to describe a strong leader.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Well, those prompts are really useful for monitoring too. You can use them to regularly check for those subtle biases that might be lurking beneath the surface.
It sounds like it takes a lot of creativity and careful thought to come up with those prompts, to really get at the heart of the issue.
It does. You have to have a good understanding of where biases might be hiding and how they might show up in the AI's responses. It's like being a detective, always looking for clues.
This whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening. It's clear that dealing with AI bias is a complex challenge, and it takes a lot of different approaches to address it effectively.
It really does. It's not just about making a few tweaks to the algorithms or cleaning up the data. It's about changing the way we think about AI and how we develop it. Ethics needs to be part of the conversation from the very beginning.
It's like building a house. You don't just slap on the foundation and hope for the best. You have to carefully plan and consider every detail to make sure it's strong and stable.
That's a great analogy. So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for AI development in this whole bias thing?
That's a great question. And it just so happens that the Tech Radar article has some thoughts on that.
Perfect. Let's dive into that. Welcome back to AI Explained. So we've spent a good chunk of time talking about AI bias, how it sneaks in, and some ways to try and fix it. But where do we go from here? What's next?
That's a great question. And you know what? The Tech Radar article actually has some really interesting thoughts on that. They talk about this idea that, well, getting rid of AI bias isn't a one-time thing. It's not like you just check it off your list and you're done.
Yeah, it's more of a journey than a destination,
Right.
right?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's a constant process of checking, adjusting, and improving.
Makes sense. It's like AI is always learning and changing, so we have to keep up with it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, tweaking the technical stuff. It's about really shifting our mindset, making sure that ethics are at the core of everything we do with AI from the very beginning.
It's like ethical AI by design, building it in from the ground up.
Exactly. So the article digs into a few key areas that I think are worth highlighting. First, it really emphasizes this idea of continuous monitoring and evaluation. Like, we can't just assume that once we've addressed some biases, everything's good to go.
We have to keep watching, keep testing.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because AI systems are constantly learning and evolving as they interact with more data, more people, more of the world. So new biases can pop up along the way.
It's like a constant game of catch-up, huh?
In a way, yeah. But it's a game we have to play if we want to use AI responsibly. We need to be proactive and stay ahead of the curve.
So it's not just about the tech, it's about us too, the humans behind it all.
Exactly. It's about making sure that we're building AI in a way that aligns with our values, with our vision for a more fair and equitable world.
And that's where things like explainable AI come in, right?
Yeah, XAI, that's a big one.
It is. The article touches on this, and it's super interesting. So the idea is that with XAI, the AI can actually explain how it came to a decision.
Wait, so instead of just giving you an answer, it can tell you why it gave you that answer.
Yep. Like it can show its work, so to speak.
That's amazing. It's like it can finally tell us what's going on inside that black box.
Exactly. And that's huge for dealing with bias, because if we can understand how the AI is making decisions, we can better see if those decisions are fair or not.
It's like it gives us a way to hold the AI accountable,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. We can check its reasoning and see if there are any biases creeping in.
It's a level of transparency that we just haven't had before. And I think that's really exciting. It feels like we're moving in the right direction.
I think so too. And the article talks about another important area for future work: better ways to measure fairness in AI systems. Right now, it's kind of a wild west out there.
How so?
Well, there's no one agreed upon way to measure fairness. So it's hard to compare different AI systems and see which ones are doing better, in terms of bias.
It's like trying to measure distance using different units, like inches and centimeters. It's hard to compare apples to oranges, so to speak.
Exactly. So if we could come up with some standardized ways to measure fairness, it would be a game changer.
It would allow us to track progress, identify best practices, and hold developers accountable.
Exactly. And that's ultimately what it's all about, right?
Yeah, it's about using AI to make the world a better, fairer place.
Well said.
This has been such an insightful discussion. I feel like I've learned so much about the complexities of AI bias, but also about the potential for solutions and the incredible work that's being done in this field. It's definitely a topic that deserves our continued attention and thoughtful consideration.
I couldn't agree more. It's a journey we all need to be part of.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into AI bias. We hope this episode has given you a lot to think about, and we encourage you to continue exploring this important topic. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insightful discussions on AI and other fascinating subjects. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.